Welcome, everybody. I'd like to call to order the meeting of the Budget and Business Services Committee for today, which is May 11th, 2022. Welcome, staff and members of the audience, and it's great to have everyone here. So we have 4 information items today. The Budget and Business Services Committee calendar, which is our standing item, an Empower SF update, which we will spend about 20 minutes on, and then we're going to take a big chunk of time to talk about the local control and accountability plan. So that'll be from approximately 5:30 to 6:45. That'll be the kind of big piece of the meeting. And then our last item is the PEEF, Public Education Enrichment Fund, fiscal year 22-23 expenditure plan update. Anything else before we begin?
No.
All right.
Commissioner Bogus want to come out?
Oh, hi, Commissioner Bogus. Good to see you. Commissioner Matamidi is encouraging me to invite you up here.
If you'd like.
But we're happy to have you there wherever you'd like to be. And President Lamb will be joining us a little bit late. So let me turn it over to, not even late really, because we're just starting.
Okay,
so,
perfect. Yes.
So let me turn it over to Director Gordon.
Good evening, everybody. And our first item tonight is our standing item, the Budget and Business Services calendar and agenda. You're good. We are ready. So as the slides are coming up, we are rounding out this year's worth of Budget and Business Services meetings. So we are we have had some changes looking at this slide, which is our agendas over the course of the school year. We have a few postponements to either the June meeting or another meeting of the board for several resolutions. And I think there's also been some discussion about potential additional topics to be added to the June meeting next month. So more to come on that. And then on the next slide, we have our timeline, which also we are almost through this fiscal year. We are at the point in time now where we'll be doing a deep dive into the LCAP today in preparation for joint advisory recommendations and the presentation of the LCAP to the full board in June. The same with the recommended budget. We're in the final stages of bringing all of the pieces together to prepare the budget for presentation to you all and submission to the CDE after approval, and have key board dates in June coming up next month. That concludes the presentation.
Thank you very much. All right, we're going to move on to the Empower SF update. And
Can I ask a quick question about the calendar?
oh, yeah, please. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So just a quick question about the calendar. So just as far as the order of operations around the joint advisory recommendations, so catch me up to where we are as far as the advisories seeing the LCAP and being able to provide input, and how those steps will work for the community input prior to June 30th.
Got it. Do you want me to?
Sure.
Okay. So Michelle is going to come up and share a little bit of information.
I did not see you here, Michelle. Hi.
Okay, hi, I can provide a little more information on that. And actually, I was just about to message folks. We are, let me see, I've had conversations with APAC and DLAC and PAC. And we have an LCAP task force meeting on this coming Monday at 4 o'clock. And we will be we're still trying to get a couple more conversations happening, virtual, maybe one in person. The Chinese Parent Advisory Council and some other community groups are organizing one for our monolingual Chinese families. So we're getting there, but we're definitely way behind schedule compared to previous years. And we are actually looking to postpone our presentation of our recommendations instead of trying to do it in May, which the way the calendar falls, actually this year, it's kind of like a week earlier than it would normally be. And we need all the time we can get. So we were going to request to present the joint advisory report at the first board meeting in June, which I think is, I don't know the date offhand, sorry, but thank you, the 14th. And then, yes, I think that's where we're at.
Okay, and then, but have you seen a draft of the LCAP?
We have seen content that is related to it for the update. We've seen things like the processes, I think, of much of what's going to be presented today, where the process that was done internally mid-year around looking at what has been effective this year, what hasn't, what we want to keep doing, and some focal questions to help families prioritize.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. Thank you for doing all that work.
And Commissioner Matomedy, we do also have the draft of the revised goals and actions posted on the SFUSD website now. So that is really some of the culmination of that mid-year review. So we have not distributed that as the draft LCAP widely during these sessions, but it is available, and that has been what we've been drawing from for the engagement so far.
Thank you very much for the clarification on the timing and the content.
All right, thank you. We're going to move on to our next item, which is the Empower SF update. Welcome, Chief Dodd. Before we do that, is there any public comment? Is anyone here for public comment on Empower SF? Seeing none. Okay, great. So Chief Dodd, turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, Commissioners, President Lamb. Tonight, we'll share a brief progress update on Empower SF that builds on the update provided at last month's Budget and Business Services meeting. I'll provide a status update of some of the issues we shared at the last meeting, highlight some additional issues that we are working on, and give some updates on our ongoing challenges, as well as the actions we're taking to provide greater clarity, support, and transparency for our employees. As Dr. Matthews shared last night at the board meeting in his opening remarks, we know that having to experience issues or even confusion with one's pay creates significant hardships for our employees, and coming at a time when we've experienced so much instability and stress from the pandemic, that makes it that much more challenging. We are making progress. It doesn't feel fast enough, and the team continues to work furiously to address both technical and process issues at the systems level, at the individual level, and put in systems and structures in place so that we're able to minimize and sustain moving forward as we move forward, so that we can help rebuild trust and confidence in us and the district, and provide for a more stable summer and a stronger start to the school year. Next slide. I know we're looking to keep this brief. I'm not going to go through all of the content in the presentation, but you have it for your review. I am using a similar format as we used last time, just the looking back, where are we right now, and what we're working on moving forward. Next slide, please. And then it's like 2 slides. Next slide, please. As a reminder, what we're driving toward, that future state, want to keep that in our mind, and reminding ourselves of that, even though we are not there yet, but to have an understanding of what we're aiming toward. And what we're experiencing right now is the complexity of all of our processes coming to a head, and the complexity of our district in serving nearly 11,000 employees. And what that transition from our previous state to where we're trying to go, and all of the issues and challenges and misses that come from that, but really coming from the sort of outdated systems, practices, that institutional knowledge that isn't necessarily well documented or understood, and trying to bring all of that into something new, while we're also changing our practices and our processes, and sort of all of that coming to a head as to where we are. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So with that, as I shared, we are making progress. It would be great if that were just sort of a straight upswing, but we have improvements and then additional issues coming in, so I'm going to highlight some of those as well. As I said, progress, but still a lot of work to do to get us to that stable state. And wanting to even improve upon where we were before Empower SF, recognizing that we had struggles and issues before, and a lot of the underlying infrastructure and supports that we had in place is also contributing to the issues and challenges that we're experiencing now. So looking at both sort of fixing where we are and putting that infrastructure in place so that we're able to be more sustainable moving forward. We are seeing demonstrably fewer issues of significant pay, although pay issues are still being experienced by our employees. And even when it's one issue, that is a person that is critical and the highest priority to them. And we want to treat that and treat them as the highest priority as well. So I'll talk through some of these issues, again, organizing them around our process or our organization, the system itself, and then our data issues as well. Next slide. So again, not going to go through all of these, but did put in a color coding system, if you will, so to see where we're making some progress. Green does not necessarily mean that no one is being impacted by it. In every pay cycle or a change that gets made, there will be, we have, like I said, nearly 11,000 employees, so there might be an issue, but in terms of being able to address the backlog that we had or the original issue, and then moving into managing and supporting those cases as they come up. On this slide, just to highlight a couple of things that we still experience challenges with our leaves, particularly the leaves that we had at the time of go live of transitioning from the fall or winter into this year. We have done a lot in terms of around leaves, of doing process deep dives between our HR teams and our payroll teams, looking at how we can better leverage the system with notifications and workflows. It's a very labor-intensive process in terms of a leave and the support required for the employee. So being able to sort of map that all through and just managing our own capacity constraints in supporting our employees. Deductions, I was going to have as a green, but we did identify an issue yesterday that's impacting about 37 employees. We have a plan in place, though, that we're able to remedy that and move forward and do proactive communications, which again is different than where we were even a month or two ago, where we were in much more of a reactionary mode. Still reactionary, but putting those proactive steps in place. And then I call out still red is around our taxes and withholdings. We are bringing in an external auditor to dig in deeply to our 2021 tax issues that many employees are experiencing. And so this is one of the focus areas for that work. Next slide. Again, I'm going to pass on these, but as you can see where we're making progress and where we still have work to do, and I'm going to dig into a couple of these in a moment. Next slide. Highlighting our deferred net pay, this is an area of focus. As we know, we have communicated to all certificated educators. The slide deck here includes information, a link to that announcement that we shared, and we're actively engaged with UESF around our strategies for July, for the July paycheck. Next slide. We do have some new issues that we are working on, and I would like to highlight a couple of them. Some, as you can see, are already green and that we've been able to address them and resolve them already. We do have one red issue here, which impacts our classified employees. We are working with, we transmit files to the city for retirement purposes, and the city itself was also going through their own upgrade, and as we were, and so working with them on the new requirements for that file transmission. It's been an iterative process. We believe we're in the final stages of that, and then we'll have some backlog and catch up to do in that area. But we have been delayed in terms of transmitting those files, that information to CFERS. And then moving through our other issues as well so that we can get them all to green. Next slide. And I'm happy to come back to any of these with questions. We've heard loud and clear the importance of and the need for information. We have relaunched a known issues and resolution page on our SFUSD website, and we broadcast that out through direct email and through our district channels, communication channels. We update it every Wednesday with the known issues and any resolutions or updates as well. And even like what you can expect to see in your paycheck, for example. We did that for the last April paycheck for educators. Next slide. We are, when we do send messages, we all get a lot of information, and it's hard to cull through an inbox and go back to something that had instructions or steps. So on the website as well, any of our district-wide messaging we post in one place so that they can be more easily accessible. And we're also, we did some in-person clinic last week, and we have dates forthcoming in working with UESF on dates and times, but May 17th, June 14th, and then we'll also set a July one with a particular focus to, in addition to our employees around DNP, but we will be in summer school as well. Next slide. We want to and are actively looking, we have some activities around providing financial sort of support and guidance for our educators and employees. One resource that is available now that we want to share and make sure people are aware of is through our own SFUSD Employee Assistance Program. There's free coaching and guidance around tax questions, financial questions that employees can leverage. We are looking at expanding that type of one-on-one financial coaching as well as looking at the potential of a loan program for educators impacted by DNP. So we may be coming back to you, likely coming back to you with more information and a request around that, but really wanting to support educators as much as possible and all employees. Next slide. User experience improvements, our pay statements look different, there's different terminology, all our processes are new, and so we've been focused in a number of areas around improving the user experience. That was my time. Okay. 10. Yes, of course. Thank you. I appreciate the timers. So making improvements around pay statements, there's when there is an adjustment from a previous pay period, there's this diff pre-P that is very confusing to people and makes no sense and doesn't call out what is that difference for. So we are working on being able to break that down, working on the timesheet process, putting in additional guides and sort of helping to make that more intuitive, and providing more information that's accessible on the employee profile that folks may have been used to seeing in a pay stub or a pay statement, and making that available in the profile screen. Next slide. Next slide. And then looking forward, and I can end on this slide, there's additional content that I shared in the board meeting last time, but we can save that for any questions. Just wanting to highlight our continued challenges. We are still constrained and have capacity constraints. We are trying to hire for our payroll team, for our HR team, analytical support that's needed, system administration. That takes time, and we also have challenges around talent and salary and competitive salaries. But we need to make sure that we have the infrastructure, that again, the infrastructure in place. We have been reassigning existing SFUSD team members to pitch in and help out and work on Empower SF. And building capacity as well. This is new for everybody, and so doing, how do we had a model around change champions. How do we bring that back so that we're building our capacity? Responsiveness to employees. This is an area of continued improvement and growth for us. We have been making strides and making improvement, but we still have delays in terms of getting back to employees and resolution, especially if an employee is impacted by a couple of factors. But even from the being in it and learning from the experience, we'll be redesigning some of our online ticketing system so that we're able to capture more information. Oftentimes there's a lot of sort of back and forth to get at and understand what the issue is before we can even move to resolution. And so how can we get that information in more upfront to help expedite that process? And looking at our ticket analysis, totally understand in the frustration when you don't hear from someone. Multiple tickets, multiple requests come in for the same issue. That makes it hard. Unfortunately, that makes it hard because you're not sure, is this the same issue or is this a different issue? So how do we look at bringing that together and making that more efficient? So again, with the whole intent of being as responsive as possible as we can to our employees. And then the technical resources that are needed. So I think I shared last time, a full year of all of the new, making sure that we have expert guides and support with us. And so looking at extending our external support and expanding that as well so that we can accelerate and move faster, as well as have that support in place as we learn and grow with the system as well. So I will pause there. The next slide, I'm sorry, I'll do one thing and then I know we're going to be done. There was a request around sort of what are all of the supports that are needed for this? Again, not going to go through these, but just so that you can see more of a full complement of areas of support that we're working on, that are under review for us, but really, again, to get to that sustainability that we desperately want and need. So you have that information here as well. And I will stop there.
I really appreciate the level of detail and thoroughness and your honest assessment of where we are. So thank you for packing a lot into 15 minutes. Let's take a few minutes, colleagues, if you have questions or comments. Again, we don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but it's important. So if there are things, let's address them.
I guess a few things. I'm just curious, when do we feel like we will be kind of out of the woods on this? Like, is there a time certain, or like what kind of direction can we give to kind of staff in that regard?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I had in my talking points that that's one of the hardest questions to answer right now, of when will this all be fixed? And so just being, wanting to be honest about that as well, that we are coming out of what was that sort of crisis, but we're not out of the woods yet, and so I think we'll experience this for the next couple of months as we close out the school year, because we also need to kind of go backwards as well to the beginning of January when we went live, as we're also planning for summer and planning to launch the new school year. So we want to make sure that we're starting the new school year at a much stronger state. What I can say is with launching a new school year and having the whole year in the same system with the 6 months of learnings that we have, that will put us into a much stronger place. A number of the issues that we're experiencing are from that cutover, so that mid-year cutover from starting the year one way and then transitioning to another. But I don't have that date certain because I do believe that as we experience everything new for the first time, there will be issues that come with that. That's why it's so important that that we're focused on that infrastructure and getting our systems and structures in place so that we're proactive with them and can be faster in terms of our response to them. We were very much caught off guard and not as prepared as we needed to be, but putting those steps in place so that we are.
Thank you for that. I guess I'm concerned about, the like prioritization of staff to handle this issue, both going back and going forward. I know you did include, I feel like, documentation in the presentation on kind of what the additional needs were, but I guess I'm wondering, what are we doing to make sure that we're not gonna fall into a new hole when the new school year starts? And do we have, I think, 100% confidence that we have the right personnel in the right place to guarantee that?
So not 100% confident, because we need to hire, we need to bring in more capacity, and that's within across our teams to be able to not just support the platform, but our processes as well as our employees as well. So we do need to bring in additional capacity and train and support our current team members with the shift. So there's a yes and, or a both and, if you will, that needs to happen. So that's why we are focused on hiring and on building up our staff as quickly as we can. We had some interviews happening this week for positions, so that we are in a stronger state for the start of the school year. There are sort of multiple parallel work streams that we're working on as well, because we don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. So knowing that we also have challenges with hiring, how can we augment our team with temporary support coming in? So we have started to do that as well, and are going to continue to do that so that we have at least temporary support as we're looking to staff up.
I appreciate that. I think for me, I guess maybe I'm still relatively new as a board member and get very frustrated when people come and yell at me. And I think just figuring out how we're going to address that, especially since it seems to be frequent new people, same message, and just kind of continually to escalate. I know that we passed the resolution in regards to helping resolve issues in 3 days for people, and it doesn't seem like that's necessarily everyone's exact experience that we're having. And I guess I'm trying to understand what we can do to let people know what is happening so they feel less panic, or that we are actively trying to commit a crime and steal their wages.
Thank you. Right. So a number of steps and actions that we're looking to take to be able to do that. So you're right. We're not at that 3-day turnaround or 5-day turnaround for every issue that comes in, and we are also needing to prioritize those issues and questions that come in so that we're addressing, sort of any significant issues, looking at systems issues, and a lot that we're getting into are questions and just a lack of clarity and information. And so things like building out more information around how to understand your pay statement and some videos around that to try and help our employees who are just like, I need to understand what's going on here. What am I looking at? And then in terms of the responsiveness and turnaround time, we are doing more scheduling video meets and phone calls for people, because we're a culture that wants to connect one-on-one with someone and be able to talk through an issue. I wish we could do that for every single employee that we have, and that would require a much larger team than we have. But how do we make sure that we are providing those opportunities when an employee needs that as well? I think then the Third, maybe I'd say the third piece is just getting information out to let people know, here's what we're working on, here's what's happening. The known issues page on the website is one of those. It's not the only thing though. And so how are we looking at different spaces? So we present every week, not every week. There's a site leader meeting every few weeks. We provide updates there. We provide, going to meeting with our labor partners and providing updates there. So getting the word out through all of the many different channels that we have as well is another strategy that we're using.
Thank you for that. I just want to appreciate all the hard work that's going into this and knowing it's kind of an uphill battle to try to kind of dig ourselves out of this hole, as I mix metaphors. I think the thing for me though is the superintendent supervises the staff of the district and is kind of responsible for how things are managed and how resources are assessed. And I think we don't want to micromanage that, but I would say in this situation, like we really need to fix this problem. If there's anything that we need that we don't have resources to, that the board can help figure out a way to support, I think we need to figure out a way to do that with urgency, because this is a very big issue, at least for me. And I feel like this is crippling us in a lot of ways in the short term. And if we're not able to address it, I'm really concerned about the impact it's going to have on everything else that we're trying to do. And so I just feel like this is a very special issue for me, and I feel like we need to raise as much urgency to the board level to address it. I mean, really to let our staff and the people we pay and the families that we serve know that this is a top priority for us and that there's nothing preventing us from paying our workers what they deserve.
And so maybe a follow-up question based on that is, and I think you've spoken to it a little bit, Chief Todd, but do you have the authority and resources you need to put this plan into place? Or is there, right? I mean, I understand there's challenges around hiring, but like, are you getting the budget you need? Are you getting the staff support you need? Does that make sense? My question makes sense?
Yes, thank you. Yes, and nothing happens as quickly as we would like, I should say. So I think that has been the constraint of time, and I'd say figuring out all of those details of where is the funding coming from, and making sure we're going through all of our protocols and procurement processes. There are things that are impacting us in terms of our ability to move at the speed that we'd like to, and we know that we need to move at, and there are not enough hours in the day, and we're also, and I'll just share, in terms of garnering all of the support and resources, there are also other needs and priorities that we have. We're also making sure that we are have team members who are out at our schools and in our classrooms, covering classrooms. And so there is that constant balance of needs that we have, that we can't say everyone go and work on Empower. And then I think the other thing is just the skill sets and the capacities that we need. Some of that is very specialized, whether it's both not just on the technology side, but also understanding the complexity of like HR processes or payroll processes. It's hard to just, bring someone in. In terms of in terms of resources and support that will be needed, we will need some support around the launching of that loan program, and so that is something that we will be coming to you for, as well as additional technical resources from an implementation partner to be able to provide us with extended partnership and support. That is also going to be a need that will require a contract amendment, as well as additional funding and resources for. And so our hope is to be able to bring that to you, well, not hope, we need to bring that to you as early as possible, which would probably be that first June meeting, to get that moving and get that in place to be able to extend beyond the support that we have that goes until August at this point.
So I'm looking at like the second or the last slide where it's looking at the short-term actions, near-term actions, long-term actions. And over summer, when things are, quieter, classrooms are not filled. I'm wondering what kind of user testing is going to be happening to garner confidence and assurances that as we go into the new full year cycle, that testing has been done to ensure that there aren't problems. And I'm wondering about partnership with our educators around user testing, as I hear you talking about this, like even with the summer homepage update, if there's opportunities to do some user testing and get some feedback about how things look, how things feel, and also do the testing around the year-round operations of this platform to ensure that it is going to be smoother than what we've experienced. I mean, it sounds like it's likely, but just to establish confidence prior to educators coming back, or,
Yeah, thank you for that. Right. So when we do our testing, that we're testing it from both a technical perspective, a functional perspective, and a user perspective. And so leveraging strategies that we've done in other implementations in the past, bringing in a group of educators or employees and running sort of a mini usability lab, paying stipends for that. So again, there will be costs associated likely with that. The other piece too, and I didn't share this earlier or last month, but in reflecting on as we plan for the upcoming year with onboarding of new teachers and the launch of the new school year, the importance of training and time with people, that was something that we didn't really have last year for a number of reasons. Reopening school year back in person was obviously the primary focus, but also especially when you're learning new tools, it is helpful to be in person. And so we did a lot virtually, and we continue to do a lot virtually. We'll have a digital district day, which is an annual event that we do, and we'll continue to do that virtually, but having in-person opportunities for training with our school secretaries, with educators, within office hours, so doing that as well.
I just want to echo what Vice President Bogus said, and I think you've heard it. I know you all feel it too, since you're, doing the work every day at this entrenched level. That absolutely needing to continue the acceleration of, and I understand there's the complexities. I think there is something that I would like to see in how we communicate this to the broader general public. So I see that the update, of Empower under the employee kind of page, but I do think, and I'm sorry that Deputy Superintendent, I see her, Gentle Blythe. How do we communicate this to the public? Because there's also a confidence level that we need to continue to build around reporting out the progress, the transparency, the real kind of realities of what is still needed and what support is needed. And that's where I'm really particularly honing in on, since we haven't talked about it, is slide 17 around those additional supports needed, and look forward to not only on their progress, but really kind of diving maybe deeper in the coming months. And I'm assuming this is going, Chair Alexander, this is going to be a continue standing item, because we cannot, take anything for granted, that we have to continue reporting out that progress and where the staff is really seeing when we do hit up against additional complexities or roadblocks. One of the, I think, key things that I was really honing in was that external audit, right? How do we ensure that, and I noticed that's in the phase 1 progress. So I'd be curious if you could talk a little bit about the timing there. What are going to be the findings, and what do you think will be coming out of that recommendations or audits, and will that be inclusive to what's already kind of in the hopper, so to speak, for the budget for this next year? And you might not know, and that's okay.
don't have answers to all of those questions, but helpful guidance as we work on this. So we started, and that is underway through with our legal office doing an assessment of our whole process of our requirements development, request for proposals, our evaluation process, so that we can identify lessons learned from that. The next piece of as I mentioned, of our audit will be around, and maybe Megan could speak a little bit more to that, around a couple of key areas, in particular, looking at our taxes, and both from 2021 and current, and the impact currently. In terms of, I would say that depending on the component, the audit may look and feel different. It might not be conducted by the same organization or throughout the whole process, because we want to also look at sort of the configuration. We have done an assessment of what's called our the workforce section of the system, so of our leaves and our time and attendance, and we'll have recommendations from that in terms of what did we miss, what improvements can we make, what do we, based on the issues that we've been experiencing, what do we have to do moving forward. So those are just a couple of examples. I don't know if you want to say anything more about the.
Sure, happy to. So I am underway with discussing scope with a firm that's really is broken out in two components of first looking at what occurred with our tax withholdings in 2021, and then looking at since go live, not just at our taxes or even a specific scope, that they would be looking more holistically, trying to look for areas of risk at a higher level, and then helping prioritize areas that they would then do a deeper dive. So more to come on that. Happy to answer any questions, but I'm still in the discovery phase, just meeting with them tomorrow, actually. So after tomorrow, I'll have a lot more clarity.
And just to give you a sense of what I'm honing in on, and I'll continue to kind of have a keen eye to, is one, the audit. So thank you. I look forward to how that develops. The other piece is around systems building, right? I hear oftentimes our systems, I think Commissioner Matomedy names it like duct tape and gum, and that's part of the modernization, right? We committed to it. I was one of the leading supporters for this. And while, as Commissioner Bogus says, having the fury of the public, as rightfully so, and of our educators and our staff, for me, I'm honing in, although it's not my day job, it's all of up to you as our experts and our professionals around, so how are we building stronger systems? And that is the aspect around the payroll processing professional services. I'm kind of gleaning from the description around how are we looking at our payroll processes, the off cycles, because the leaves, right? And if I'm correct, and this is something I'm also looking into the future, how do we tie our HR systems to our financial systems that also need to get modernized? The fact that we used to have for at least 2, if not multiple years of under budgeting for our leaves. So that, to me, if I look at my duration of 3 years here, that it is very clear that there was something that has been a gap, has been something that we have not been able to wrap our arms around. And so that's something that is really important, because if we don't have, and I know you feel this as well, but if we don't have the most basic strong systems in place, then we're going to constantly be in a crisis, responsive mode, and that's just not the way we want to operate our school district and as a public education institution that's stewarding billions of dollars. So I just wanted to express those are really the two things, at least in the near term. I would like to follow even more closely through the Budget and Business Services Committee here.
Thank you, colleagues. I'm going to ask if it's okay that we move on, and I think and so we will agendize this for next month, and those, I think, President Lamb just outlined some important items, and I think other colleagues have too. And so maybe we can highlight those next month, and I'll actually agendize more time next month for this, because it sounds like we need to have a in-depth discussion, which I think is really good. So, but I do want to get to the LCAP today. So thank you so much, Chief Todd. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate your work on this. In keeping with our commitment to be talking about student outcomes, which we as a board have talked about, we want to spend a sort of bigger chunk of time tonight really looking at our LCAP, the Local Control Accountability Plan. But I want to say a couple of framing things before we get into this discussion. Number one is that we're in the third year of a 3-year plan. So we're going into the 3rd year, right? So the big sort of design, rewrite of the LCAP will actually be taking place during next school year. And I think we really should wait, the current year is year 1? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, because we got the extension. Okay, my apologies. So, sorry, my point there really, thank you for clarifying that. My point really was that at this point in the year, we're not at a point where we can make major revisions to LCAP for next school year. I think that was what I was trying to say. So I think I got the year timing wrong. So I think there were questions last year when we approved the 3-year plan about whether the process had been adequate. I think that's what I was trying to say. So I think that we can make revisions along the way, but we're probably not going to make huge revisions right now. I think that's what I was trying to say. That's one thing. The second thing is we need to start to have the conversation in any event, right? And so, and I think the board has indicated the desire to do a better job of aligning LCAP priorities with our budget, or aligning our budget resources to our LCAP priorities, as well as ensuring that those priorities are the right ones. We've also noted that there's a lot of activities, probably too many activities. So there's a lot of things that we've already kind of noted. The purpose of today really is to begin the conversation, and to begin the conversation by looking at student outcome data. So well, first of all, let me see, is there public comment on this item? Yes. Is it all right if you go first? Yes, I'm gonna have public comment, and then we're gonna have a brief overview, and then we're gonna do about 15 minutes on each of our 3 goals. So that's kind of the structure. So go ahead, we'll do 2 minutes.
I'm not an expert at this. All right, thank you. My name's Jeff Lucas. I'm a parent of a junior in the district. I understand where we are in the local control and accountability plan process. I just want to make a few brief comments. So there are goals, and 3 major goals that seem to have been the goals for many, many years, and that's fine. And there are student outcomes. And a rhetorical question is, what happens when our outcomes are not being met? The example I'll pick is chronic absenteeism. Fall 2021, chronic absenteeism was some 21%. And chronic absenteeism does appear in the local control and accountability plan. And there was a comment made that it's been looked at, pre-pandemic, there was a program to try to improve it. I want to bring attention to it, and that we need to relook at that and bring more attention to it. Chronic absenteeism is not just an outcome. It's not a student outcome. It's an input. How effective can a curriculum be if a student is not present? What happens to kids who miss weeks of a school year? The multi-tiered system of supports allocates partially based on race. Curiously, the 3 races that are prioritized in the multi-tiered support system of supports also have the highest chronic absenteeism rates. I want to move on and acknowledge, I appreciate every time I come to one of these meetings, I learn more There's more info on the district's website. So the LCAP draft, I appreciate that it's there and have found it. Thank you. And finally, there's a long time lag between when measurements occur and action takes place. So for example, the attendance data from this year will be included in the 2023 LCAP, or do we have to wait till next year to see that data? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And I think our public commenter raised a lot of the issues we want to discuss, which is great. I mean, I think this is exactly the kind of dialogue that we want to be having as a board, and looking at those measures and asking if activities that we've undertaken to address them are not working, let's not keep doing the same thing and getting the same results. That doesn't make sense. So that's the purpose of this. Again, we're not going to do it all tonight. The goal here is to open that conversation and begin that conversation. So first, we're going to do a brief overview, no more than 5 minutes. I'm gonna have a timer. And then we're going to go into each goal, and we're going to have a brief 3-minute introduction to each goal, and then board discussion. Are you up, Emery?
Yes,
Okay,
my
Director.
time starts now. Good evening again, everybody. My name is Anne-Marie Gordon. I am the Executive Director of Budget Services, and I will be covering the presentation. So I'll go through the slides this evening, but we do have district staff in attendance to answer questions and participate in the discussion about the goals, actions, metrics, and really the substance, the meat of the local control and accountability plan. I guess we can go ahead to the next slide. So we've had a few presentations and discussions about the local control and accountability plan so far this calendar year, at the February 22nd meeting of the board and at last month's Budget and Business Services Committee meeting. And then we will be having much more discussion and much more opportunity to dive in at the June meetings to discuss the next year's LCAP and recommended budget. Next slide, please. So for anyone who is unfamiliar with the LCAP, it is a 3-year plan that describes the goals, actions, and planned expenditures to support positive student outcomes in our districts. It began as a document to build accountability around the local control funding formula, and has recently expanded to create more space for us to speak more fully to all of our district resources and how they are aligned to our vision and goals. There is, you're good. There is a bit of an inherent challenge in putting together the LCAP, because we are hoping to create a coherent picture that really addresses so many different things. And that's what we're hoping to illustrate here, that we have state-defined priorities, state-defined focal populations, a district mission and vision that includes universal goals, essential school supports, student competencies, board resolutions, and we're trying to put all of that together in a way that reflects everything we want it to and meets the statutory and compliance-oriented requirements of the document. So it's really trying to do many things at once. Next slide, please. Similarly, the data and the metrics that are reported in the LCAP are a combination of state-defined metrics on the California School Dashboard and locally defined metrics that we measure and track within the district and determine ourselves. And we have a link on this slide to the California School Dashboard. You will have to go to the 2019 year to see our most recent and the most recently available data across these different categories. Next slide, please. And so actually that is about the end of the brief introduction, because from here we will be going into more depth through the content of the LCAP. I did want to take a moment to point everybody to the Budget and LCAP website, or the page on SFUSD's website. because we will be using visuals from our 21-22 LCAP infographic to help guide today's discussion. The LCAP document itself is very detailed, but that can mean that it isn't always the most accessible and reader-friendly. So the infographic is a helpful alternative to see all of that information in a slightly more accessible way. And on the website, there is both a full infographic and an abbreviated infographic that's translated in English, Spanish, and Chinese. Yes.
Maybe this is going to be covered later, but I'm just curious if you could just talk about how the LCAP relates to what happens at like a family school site.
Sure. Yes. So the LCAP overall, right? The idea is that the LCAP is a document that if you you can go high to low or low to high. So I think if you maybe start at a school site and think about the many things that are happening at a school site, right? The staff that's there, the programs that are being run, the curriculum, staff training, professional development, all of those things are different activities and actions that are happening to support positive student outcomes. The vision is that the LCAP compiles, in a way, all of those different activities and actions into one story of the district overall. And so you won't see every detail of every school in the LCAP, but the goal is that a parent or a community member could read through the actions in the LCAP and recognize and identify and understand what is happening for their student at school that aligns to what's there.
Yeah, and I think if we get really good at this, then instead of having this slide with so many things on it, we'll have a few priorities that we can see a through line district-wide and at particular school sites that might look differently in schools, but that are really reflective of priorities that everybody in the organization understands. And that's, I think, this is in one sense, it's a compliance bureaucratic document, but it actually is an opportunity to prioritize, right? And an opportunity to say, as a district, like this is what we believe are high leverage strategies. And as our public commenter said earlier, if they're not working, we need to change them, right? So our priorities may, our goals may stay the same, but our priority ways of achieving those goals are going to need to change if they're not working. So thank you for that overview. Do you have another question? Yeah.
Similar to Vice President Bogus's question about school sites, the other piece, when I look at the bubbles, slide 4, I know that I'm just going to flag this. Like, I know that this is a state mandated document. And so the LCFF funding is what's prioritized and mandated for inclusion. But similar to how the school sites are rolling up and feeding into the priorities, it would also, as we get better at this, be great to see how all of our funding sources, because if you look at here, we talk about the LCFF focal populations, but we also have our own weighted student formula, MTSS, et cetera. And so how we can, and then other supplemental funding from various sources, and how that is also guiding and aligned with the priorities. So I know we're working on it. This is great progress, but I'm just going to continue to flag my interest in seeing not just one part of the pot, but the whole pot.
Okay, let's keep going and we can keep discussing as we go. So let's move to goal 1. We're going to try to spend about 15 minutes on each goal. So I'm going to set a timer for 3 minutes, which may be challenging, but I want to leave time for a discussion. So if we could just kind of really quickly say, this is high level stuff, we can look at the details as we discuss.
Sounds good. And the one thing that I do want to add that we'll see throughout and that I'll get to in a minute is that community engagement is a fundamental component of the LCAP that I didn't mention in the overview, and really throughout the document when it comes to the process of evaluating activities and also looking at the document as a whole, input and feedback from our stakeholders, educational partners is a critical component of this process. So with that, I will go into goal 1, which these goals come from our strategic plan, Transform Learning, Transform Lives. Our universal goals, number 1 is student achievement. Create learning environments in all of our schools that foster engaged and joyful learners and that support every student reaching their potential. On the next slide, we have an overview of essentially the themes, the types of actions that are within goal 1. You'll see this for each of the goals as we go through. The next slide is where we see from the infographic the outcomes that are associated with goal 1. The way these visuals are structured is the metric has the little icon, and then the more prominent number or dashboard image is our target. So the target outcome where we will be in 23-24 when we're completing the 3-year LCAP. And the smaller gray is our baseline using 2018-19 data, which is the most recent year that is available. On the next slide, we have the initial focus actions related to student achievement. And so these actions, again, will have the same structure for each of the 3 goals. These are the initial actions that our superintendent's leadership team has identified to prioritize of the many actions, the many activities in our LCAP for next year. We plan to refine these as we receive input from you all and through our community engagement. Part of our community engagement, the questions that we're focusing on are sharing these focus actions and asking for feedback, trying to get a sense of whether anything is missing, and also really providing time to reflect and understand how these actions are experienced on the ground at schools. So I won't read them. I encourage us to discuss them as we get into conversation. And then the last slide for goal 1 is a few additional goals. We didn't put them all on the slides, but these were a few other goals that do help create a well-rounded picture of many of the topics and kind of areas that goal 1 touches. And further, these are 3 additional actions that through the mid-year review were assessed and kind of evaluated as, or essentially that we are implementing successfully in reflecting in that mid-year review. So there we go.
I guess I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how this reflects on like the experience of individual students and families. I feel like what I hear a lot is like families wanting to have an understanding of kind of how LCAP decisions are going to impact their individual child. And it feels to me like the LCAP isn't necessarily about that, but I feel like that's what people are looking for. They want to see how the actions and activities lead to different outcomes. And that's not really present in the LCAP. And I guess, how do we wrestle with that and I guess address that? Or maybe if you feel like that is something you've never heard from anyone before, I can maybe reassess if that's not it.
I can start. I tagged in support. But I think that is a question that is really, a lot of people struggle with that question, wanting to see the through line from this big plan to how it's actually impacting, my child's experience, right? What is it changing, in having all of this discussion about the LCAP? So.
I think that is true, Ms. Gordon. Yeah, I do think that this is the perpetual question. I feel like one of the themes that we get out of our educational partner input is we fundamentally agree with the strategies and actions that you've outlined, but we don't see how they are taking shape at our individual schools. And I think the place where that happens would be in the context of the school plan for student achievement. Because in that context, school site councils and school teams are supposed to be looking at the individual data. Our RPA team puts out data summary and both formative and assessment and formative and summative assessments for school teams to look at, to identify where are the areas that we are making progress, and what are those actions so that we can better understand them and continue to replicate them, and where are the areas that we have challenges, particularly for our student groups, and what are the actions that we're taking. I think that we can get better and stronger at utilizing that SIPSA process, which I think has felt for a lot of folks as a compliance exercise. And we are starting to use this phrase of from compliance to commitment. How is SIPSA a physical manifestation of what we're saying we're holding ourselves accountable to as a school team in service of the students who we see and engage with every day? And I think that's definitely a place that we can continue to grow and emphasize as we're better understanding that process and connection.
I have a comment on that. Can we go back to the previous slide with the focus? Yeah, those ones. So if we look at the second one, ensure access for teachers and administrators to summative and formative assessment results for the purpose of learning about students' needs, incorporating learning from data into lessons and units so that students are engaged in learning at high levels and differentiating instruction. I can imagine creating some questions for parents like, does your child's teacher at the elementary school, does your child's teacher able to tell you where your child is in literacy and math and how they're tailoring instruction to that child's needs or something? I'm just off the top of my head, but like, I think if that's an opportunity where we actually could translate these for families, and actually then families could help hold us accountable, where they're saying to teachers, like, I know that this is, the expectation is that you're supposed to have access to, you're supposed to be assessing my child, you're supposed to know where they're at in their learning, and you should be able to tell me about it, right? So I think some of these things, if we can kind of translate them into clearer English that everyone can understand, they could actually be really, really useful, so that we can collectively say that's just a basic expectation. Every teacher in SFUSD should know where kids are at and be able to communicate that to families. But I think that's, again, where there's opportunity in kind of building on what Chief Hogendijk is talking about, of like aligning that with the school plan, aligning it with what's happening at the district, and aligning it with conversations that are occurring among people at schools.
Can I add just one more thing that I think will is going to assist us in this effort? We have had a district-wide focus this year for both site and central office administrators on continuous improvement. So how are we better understanding what it is that we're trying to improve, what actions and why are we taking them, and how we would know those actions or changes led to improvement in this context of this discipline around understanding what is it that we're doing and is it getting the impact that we want. And I think what we're definitely learning through this process is the muscle that we need to build is understanding both implementation and process measures. So we might say we're going to impact literacy, right, through professional development, focused attention on small group instruction, et cetera. But if we don't understand whether or not we're actually doing those things in the way that we have articulated them, then it becomes harder to assess that progress. And so I do think that that has been a general learning as we're getting better at getting better in the parlance of continuous improvement, that we do need to better understand what types of process measures we need to have in place in order to know whether or not these actions are taking place at all levels of the organization.
Okay, so stepping back for just a second, what I'm trying to understand, and I'm looking at a number of different documents. I'm looking at the presentation today. I'm looking at the nice new summary document that's on the budget and LCAP page. Thank you for that. And then I'm looking at the actual LCAP. And so the question that I have is sort of foundationally, how are these goals set? And then with the continuous improvement thinking, how do they get reported out? What systems are in place? And then what is that feedback across school sites, like cohorts or across the system? And then also up K through 12, like how are our educators and administrators giving that feedback and getting that feedback from their colleagues and peers in this work to share what's working, what isn't working around outcomes. And so it's like the what, like how did these get here? And then what is the feedback loop beyond just board presentations? Like I want to see a little bit more into that. And I know that we're working to strengthen our community input and so forth, but I still haven't understood, like within the system that exists, how is this functioning today? How do we get here to be looking at these? Yeah.
If I could just jump, I'm sorry for, and also I think if you could just talk about the budgetary constraints on executing these and whether or not we're fully funded to implement kind of everything within our goals for all students wholly, or is there a gap in between the two? Does that make sense as well? Hopefully.
And I'm saying this in a spirit of, because I know we are learning. I'm not saying this like, why isn't this all, I really want to understand how we're learning and what the steps are to get this to be a stronger, more meaningful document for all of us to work together.
Definitely, and I can start again, and then I welcome others to chime in. But I think that something that we kind of realized a while ago now and have not been able to fully, implement change in our process is how we do actually make that through line more explicit from, for example, the LCAP task force, the advisory recommendations, and the connection and the familiarity with honestly some of these topics with school sites, starting with site leaders. I think we identified the opportunity to try and coordinate more around the LCAP with lead potentially, so that when it comes to kind of cohort leadership and how all of that comes together, there's more of, like what I would say I imagine is for goal 1 with these 3 initial focus actions, if we were to move forward with them, I think Commissioner Alexander, like you said, you could create an action plan around these 3 actions that could then be every, if you take lead as an example, but then you have every cohort working together, or all of these site leaders with an action plan of how they're going to bring how this turns into plain English, turns into something that can actually happen in a real way at school sites. And we haven't really attempted to do that in such a deliberate way by starting with the LCAP goals, the LCAP actions. We have used the metrics in the past as kind of North Stars for work around chronic absenteeism, to really anchor in certain metrics being the focus of work over the course of a year. I think the last thing I'll say is that from what I have seen, wanting to make those connections to outcomes has been particularly challenging as all of our assessments have stopped during COVID. So I think that has presented obstacles to some of this growth we want to do. And then I think on the budget piece, it's a tough question. I think that even though we want everything for our students, we also, I would say we actually, especially because of the amount of local resources that we have as a city through different local funding, I would say that I believe we have the resources to make headway in many of these objectives, but it is a matter of being able to focus and set priorities, because as we try to do everything, we stretch ourselves really thin. So I think that that's where we really feel pressure and then struggle to accomplish, right, anything, because we're trying to accomplish it all.
Could I just, I'm sorry, Commissioner, if I could just build on that with one example, just a real life example, sorry.
Let me,
I can save it for
no,
round two.
And I'm going to put 5 more minutes on this because I think this is a more general question anyway that applies to all the goals.
Okay, so I just recall a couple of regular board meetings ago when the DLAC was presenting, and there was a specific discussion of some length about one of the recommendations that they had made in the past about professional development for educators around reclassification. And that was in some ways a little bit of a confusing discussion, and I think our team, colleagues, chime in if you see it differently, felt like, okay, this is a really important question. We should regroup and clarify what's happened in the past couple of years, what should happen in the next few years. But underlying all of that, just as someone who was listening to that conversation, it felt like, there's a subtext of, are we focusing on the right things? Are we investing in the right things? Are we focusing our attention, financial resources, and strategies on the right things? If we had more clarity around the LCAP and had those through lines between the indicators of student outcomes, whether it's on the dashboard or other measures, and the strategies and the financial resources, these are the exact same things that we ideally would like to build capacity at all of our school sites to do through their own SIPSA process and budget development process at a district level. But that's an example of what the potential is, I think, of having both more clarity, choosing wisely and intentionally about the student outcomes that should be the areas of focus, and then internalizing everyone's awareness of those so that it's not, when there's a question that comes up, it's not like, oh, what is that a priority? Isn't it a priority? What have we been doing about that? What should we have been doing? What should we do now? It's by repetition, there's a groove of attention in everyone's mind that says, okay, that's goal, this is 1.06. This is action 1.06 in the LCAP, 1.06, it's actually right up there. That's an example of something that would fall under that.
So, I mean, yeah, to your point, the thing is there are 15 actions, right, under this one goal that I'm seeing in the LCAP itself. And so these are the initial focus actions, but even when I map these focus actions to the actual LCAP, they're different. Like the descriptors are different, and actually there's a different kind of intent that comes out in this summary document, and that is fine. Like I actually think what's written here is more powerful, and if that's what we're doing, more so than what's in the actual LCAP list of things for that particular item. I guess I will continue to raise and seek clarity around how priorities, 1.1 is pretty clear, but 03 and 06 are related, but are what the LCAP itself really says in the document itself. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, I just urge us to really figure out what our priorities are going to be, because right now we have 15, and I honestly don't think there's a huge amount of clarity around the purpose of those 15. They're very just descriptive of, purchases and generalized goals in some cases. So I appreciate the presentation. We're getting there. I'm just going to keep wanting to hone in and figure out like how we're aligning and how it affects the school sites and how their input and experience is affecting our budget decisions and how we're allocating our resources to support them on an ongoing basis, because we do that differently every year, and the way we get to these goals can be different year to year. So just gonna say that.
I want to see if President Lamb, if you have comments.
Yeah, just a couple. I think then what might be helpful for either staff or at the board level around dissecting around like inputs, outputs, and impact. I think as a district, we're really, and this has been some of the remarks I've given over time, even through our education recovery funds, right, to the state. I saw lots of inputs, but I wasn't clear like how we were going to measure ourselves around that progress. And so that's something that I think, as similar to building, you all are building your muscles, we're building our muscles too, to really look at, having a policy discussion examination with you all around the breakdown between activities, the output, and then the impact. And I think that is really clear for families as well, right? That don't have the intricacies of translating, interpreting from a very complex kind of quote compliance document to something like, so what is my district doing? How do I know my district is, or my child is going to be receiving the supports or interventions, academic learning that they need in the classroom, and what does that progress look like? And that goes back to, and I really appreciate the program summary. I love the infographics. I'm a big visual proponent, so learner. And I think for me around the through line, and it relates to student enrollment and where we lose our families. And so, of course, near and dear is literacy, early literacy, kindergarten readiness. And for me, I'll be honing in on that particularly because of transitional kindergarten. It's going to be a huge lift and opportunity for our district. And that we have an opportunity, if we're bringing in our families in TK, to keep them all the way through 12th grade. And that's where, to me, around the high school readiness, I've talked a lot about the importance around investing in secondary and middle school. And then, so that relates to, it sounds like the connection is to 1.03 and 1.05. But that's just kind of, my framework is really about from early, integration of kindergarten to secondary of middle school, and then how our students are finishing with us, not just in graduation rate, but around the academic development and rigor as well. So I'm curious in some of the language, like how do we measure that? That's listed in some of the focus actions. Those more comments.
Great. So if it's okay, I'm going to ask for the goal 2 If it's okay, I'm going to ask for the goal 2 overview, and then we can just kind of continue the conversation about flowing into goal 2. And feel free to come back to goal 1 if you want.
Sounds good. So goal 2 is access and equity. Make social justice a reality by ensuring every student has access to high quality teaching and learning. And on the next slide, we have the kind of short descriptions, what the actions within goal 2 are related to across a variety of really functions of the work of the district. The next slide has the goal 2 outcomes, again, focused on defining the metric and then illustrating both the target by the end of year 3 of this LCAP and the baseline where we started with 2018-19 data. And would it be helpful to explain, to like walk through an example, or does it, everybody okay on? Okay, then I'll keep it brief. Next slide is the initial focus actions within goal 2. So these, there are still, right, we still haven't lost, I think, the thread to student achievement, since all of our work is around supporting positive student outcomes. But shift into that, right, access and equity perspective. And then the next slide is, again, additional actions within goal 2 that we are kind of through our assessment are implementing successfully. And again, we'll be seeking feedback from our community around how these actions are really felt at school sites and to our community, and I guess whether any of these feel like they should be included in as focus actions in the upcoming year. And that's all.
Great, thank you. Colleagues, what is coming up for us around goal 2? Questions, comments?
I just have a clarifying question. I am trying to map to our LCAP. Are these goals different? Are the goals here different than what is our LCAP that we adopted yesterday as far as the mapping? I'm just asking. I'm trying to follow along in our LCAP as we go through.
Yeah, they are.
Okay.
I think, and the side by side, the draft that is on the website, I think is helpful if,
Okay.
if any of the language is looking different.
Okay. All right.
What we have on the slide is the shorter version of what you see in the LCAP, So 2.01 has a deeper, so it's a shorter version for space purposes on the slide, but the details you will find on the document. I hope that makes sense.
And I'd also point out to folks that are following along that for each of these goals, there's a analysis around and a recommendation around this adopt, adapt, or abandon analysis, right? So the staff has looked at each of the actions and provided a rationale for that as well. Which is not on, that's on the draft LCAP, not on the
Yes.
documents we're looking at
And
here.
I think that might help.
Thank you.
Maybe these are a little bit of both, where we aren't, in most cases, we aren't completely overhauling an action, but I would say even with 2.01 as an example, it used to be a much longer action. And the recommendation is, there is kind of an adapt and abandon selected, which is about, I think, simplifying what this action is. And it will be more of this, what you see on the slide of improving and expanding the coordinated care teams across all schools.
Thank you. I was confused. I just caught up, so I really appreciate the clarification.
I have more of a substance question than a process question on goal 2. Where are community schools? Am I missing them?
Only because I just prepped a slide for the Rules Committee meeting next week. Hold on a second. There is not a specific community schools goal or action, but what I will say is that there are components of what we have outlined in the context of a community schools toolkit, family partnership model. Nellie's in the room, so she'll probably have better information than I do. But goal 2.01 that you see there, expand the coordinated care team, is a component of that. You also find in 2.05, let me see, 2.05 I think was the wraparound services, but I'm gonna check my notes here.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah,
right.
2.05 has the wraparound services, which is also a component of community schools. 2.07 talks about social, emotional, and cultural awareness support, particular for English learners, but anyway, you see threads of that, so not a specific community schools goal, short answer.
That makes sense. It might be good to include that language, to be clear, because especially since it seems like, I think there might be, I'm hearing we might be getting the grant. Do we know yet about the grant?
In preview of coming attractions, the state posted their
heard a
agenda
rumor.
today. So yes, we do have schools that are slated for state board approval next week.
Yeah, so I'd heard that rumor, so that's exciting. So, so yeah, just to ensure that those efforts are kind of coordinated and that folks and maybe it's even expressed as sort of piloting that model in X number of schools or something so that we're being clear that we're kind of doing that as a strategy.
I was just gonna, I think one thing to offer it sort of came from the goal 1 discussion, but with there being 15 actions, I think one thing that we also seek to balance that I think speaks to the budget piece a little bit is that if we get really, really narrow and say we only have 5 actions that we're taking, we have a $1 billion budget. And so when it comes to mapping our budget to the actions, it also becomes much more, then it feels like you're not getting any information about how money is spent because the categories, the actions are so broad. So that's part of the balance in putting this together as well, is how do you get to the right level of detail in the action that we can, right, you get a little bit better sense of what money is actually being spent on without also then getting into such a level of detail that you have 100 actions. So that's just a note, I think, in acknowledging how we think about how to make the goals, actions, all of it fit together in a way that feels like we can wrap our arms around it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it's also that there's all these things that schools do, that schools have to do, right? Like where do you put a classroom teacher? I mean, theoretically, a classroom teacher is in all 3 goals, right? So it's like some things we can prioritize and target and say, yes, that money is being spent on that. Other things, it's like they're actually going to realistically actually cover a lot of these. So I think that's an important point. President Lamb.
Thank you. I'm no expert in the LCAP, but I wanted to ask about if it's not in this document, where do we set our benchmarks so we know the progress that we are making, and then how do we then land on? That informs, I would think, the adapt or abandon.
Thank you for your questions and the discussion. It's extremely helpful. With regards to the benchmarks and with regards to progress monitoring, it's in both aspects, in the implementation part and in the outcomes part. So there is progress monitoring in terms of the implementation, which is, are these actions even getting implemented? If so, are they getting implemented consistently? If yes, is the quality good enough? So once you've asked those implementation questions, then there is a whole cadre of benchmarks that we do monitor and we do report out on, right from academic to behavioral to culture climate. So throughout the year, we do have benchmarks on not just the academic areas, but we also track attendance daily, weekly, monthly, 6 weekly, and then last but not the least, we do track all the readiness indicators like high school readiness, as well as on track. So those are some of your progress measures and benchmarks that do exist based on these actions.
Well, I just think I want to just comment then, again, it's not just inquiring more so. So for example, around the coordinated care teams, I've been, a strong proponent. We have been invested in mental health, in secondary healing in our hands. I think one thing I'm particularly interested in, especially now as we are a new grantee recipient of the community schools, how are we setting enough, I say formula, but yet, a prescription, but yet allows maybe for the uniqueness of those school sites. So I think that would be helpful to kind of, I don't know if I'm using the term through line correctly, but being able to see that. And again, I named this to my colleagues. This is something that I really am wanting to bring forward more and shed more light on that at our board meetings, in committees like what we're doing right now, so that we can be better informed around those progress, because while we get those reports, I think just really offering up more discussion, more analysis amongst ourselves and with staff would be really where I'm looking to bring our work forward.
I think the one thing I will definitely emphasize is that, as Anne-Marie very rightly said, that any kind of a plan, whether it's a school site plan or this LCAP, because it's tied to budget, it has keeping the lights on and the priorities built into it. So keeping the lights on, we all have to say that's something I have to do. I have to give the assessments because the state is going to give me money for that. So right, but the use of the assessments, moving it from analysis to action, is the priority that I want to pursue. And I think things like that, if we have a set number of priorities, it will be so much more easier to then track them, report on them, and then tie some measures, both outcomes and implementation measures, to them. But I think the vastness of it is what makes it not possible and, dissipates some of the effects that we are having.
Okay, thank you, Chief Khanna. Let's move on to goal 3.
Great. Okay, so goal 3, accountability. And so this one is keeping district promises to students and families and enlisting everyone in the community to join in doing so. So goal 3 is really about how do we make sure and build systems, build structures, do the things that we have said we are committed to doing. On the next slide, hopefully familiar now, we have the actions related to accountability, the different areas of focus broadly within goal 3. The next slide is our goal 3 outcomes. And so you will see here that there are not outcomes here that are about students specifically. This is really about the structures that support students, that support our schools, related to teachers, staffing, professional development is here as well as in, I think maybe in all 3, but it's not as student specific, but you can really see how it's building that structure to support students and make sure that our schools are where we want them to be. The next slide, again, we have our initial focus actions related to accountability, leadership opportunities for students, translation, communication across a variety of means, and supporting core operations came to the surface here. And then the final slide is additional goal 3 actions that the district is implementing successfully for consideration among all of the actions in where and how we want to focus our energy next year.
Fantastic. Vice President Bogus.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is the one maybe I feel like I get the most frustration around, and I just feel like from the community perspective and like being a part of the LCAP task force over multiple years, there is, I think, a gap in what the reality is and the expectations about what is possible to happen through the LCAP process to kind of transform the experiences at school sites. I guess the thing that I struggle with is I don't know if there's anything we can do to fix that because of the way that the LCAP is kind of set up and structured. And if we really need to think about, is there another tool that we need to create that maybe is more centered around the school sites and the way that they're interpreting and actualizing these things so that families will get that, like, this is what's happening in my school as it relates to supplemental concentration funds and other state funds and how we can see the differences. But I think we also have to figure out how we deal with the narrative piece of we are trying to see incremental change and huge gaps, which don't reflect, I think, what families want to see, which is we want all students to have an equal opportunity, chance, and outcomes, and that's not happening. So I think, I guess I throw that out there to my fellow commissioners as well as staff to help us figure out if this isn't, what is the proper vehicle to really channel people's concerns, frustrations, complaints, and create more transparency on the implementation of these things at the site where you actually aren't every day.
It's interesting, Vice President Bogus, because when I was a principal, I remember when we did it wasn't called the SIPSA, it had a different name. What was it called? Balanced Scorecard. That's right. It used to be called the Balanced Scorecard. We did that at the school site. Now, I don't think I came up with that myself. I think that was an expectation from my boss. So I don't know if that's the current practice now, but I think we actually organized ours around these three goals because the three goals have been in place for a long time. So we had goal 1, goal 2, and goal 3, and we looked at data at the school during the school site council summit. We looked at data, and then we had the district goals and actions, and then we said, okay, our priority is X, Y, and Z. And so, like, if it was family empowerment, we're budgeting X amount of dollars for a family liaison. These are the outcomes we expect to see from that. And then we would share that with the community, and then we'd review that the following year. So to me, this could work at schools. And I don't know do you know what I'm saying?
No, I think the issue that I've just seen at school sites with the balanced scorecards and with school site councils is each school is a mystery unto itself, and the process, the engagement, the commitment to inclusion. And then also I think sometimes the budgetary realities, like being a part of school site council meetings where you go from being a tier 3 to a tier 2, you're talking about, let's talk about what we want to keep versus what we have to get rid of. And I think that kind of shifts the conversation from, I think what we're talking about is how do we actually bring more to support student outcomes? But I definitely agree, like maybe there is something already in use or that has been that we can look at or modify to really kind of make that be centered.
So I'm curious, having heard this discussion, what staff's response is. Like, what do you think is happening, and to this point that Vice President Bogus is raising?
I think in my career, what I have seen is there was one time, it was, I think more 2006 to 2008, that what we developed was a one-pager for families and for the school, where if this is their school site plan, that's their basic plan. But from it, we had this one pager which told you what are the key priorities for my 3 goals. And it couldn't be more than 2 or 3 priorities. And that's what got circulated. Listed along with that were the measures. And so I think that was the most powerful, that at least people knew relate to this. In my school, this is the 2 or 3 things they are doing. So it was like a one pager, but it was a supplement to the school site plan.
What about this question, and feel free anyone to respond, that Vice President Bogus is raising around kind of the expectations and culture of engagement at the school site and the variation?
If I may, I'm actually really excited to hear both of you talk about it because we've been talking a lot in the past couple of years, and we're finally starting a planning process where we think about what are the tools, for example, that families need to be able to be effective in participating in the school site council. and offering workshops that are then recorded and can be maintained on a website, but earlier in the year. So we're not saying, what are the workshops we need at the summit? Because the summit is already too late for that. We want to do it earlier in the year. And so putting together, like, and I referenced this last night at the board meeting, a comprehensive calendar sort of thing where we see, oh, and it can be used as a tool, right? For, let's say I'm the parent lead on the site council, I could use it, or the principals can use it. And it would back things out. So like if you want to start, if you need to have your budget here, you've got your community meeting here, you're planning it here, you're looking at data here, you're recruiting, members here, that kind of thing. So it's all in there, and links to things like best practices. So things like you just mentioned, Commissioner Alexander, where like we did this process. That would be an amazing process to share, right? I know there's lots of school sites that have great processes, and like listing those. So that if I was a newer principal and I was like, oh, I know I need to do this, but I don't really have any frame of reference, there's a whole body of stuff. And maybe there's even a list of like, oh, maybe this principal over at Monroe is really experienced. Maybe he'd be willing to be a mentor and partner with me or something like that. So the time is perfect to be having this conversation, and I'm excited to keep having it. Thank you.
The last thing that I'll add very briefly, but just in response to that as well, is that my mind goes to the budget and how we allocate resources to school sites, and the decisions that we ask schools to make about their resources. And so I don't have a recommendation or a solution, but I think that it makes me wonder if there are ways we might structure the way that our resources are allocated to school sites to help school site councils more naturally focus on the discussions and the decisions and the strategies that there's a collective, agreement that we want those communities to be engaged in. If there is a question about, if we acknowledge that the keep the lights on is something that every school needs to do, and we don't want there to be intensive debate over the definition of keeping the lights on, might there be something we could change in the way we structure allocations to take that off the table so that we're moving on to the next phase of discussion more easily? So I think it's more wonderings, but I think that there could be opportunity there, so that it isn't also maybe all on a site leader or on the leader of a school site council to, that training is really helping everybody get to the same place more easily.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've just been sitting here thinking a lot about what you were saying about the individual schools, and then even your example, you're a lone principal going through that, as opposed to doing that with a cohort, and then everyone's learning from each other and building upon it, and it's a shared experience. And so if a student transfers from your school to another school, there's a through line so it's not like, oh, I guess everything's kind of different over here, or and when I see accountability, and I've had the same struggle with goal 3, like I've spent time on that and thought, like, what does this really mean, especially when you look at the outcomes also have a lot around teacher retention and credentialing and things like that. But the accountability connects to the first 2 goals for me. Like, it's really just making sure that the communities at our school sites and the communities of educators are feeling connected to the work of goals 1 and 2, and able to give input meaningfully, so that that is translating in a way that is working for the students that they are serving, which are not the same at every site or across every district. So this is not like, oh, what are the things that we do? So we have a cookie cutter answer to, what each school site is how they're gonna implement, but so that it's reflective, goals 1 and 2 and all the things under them actually are working at all of our sites. And when a principal so it's just to minimize confusion, and doing things differently that aren't being shared out. So, and one of the things that I've wondered about is, again, around the measurements or the outputs here, because a lot of these goals, when they're related to families in here and students, are related to our culture and climate survey, and we have a very low response rate. Like, I know that if there's positive, in here, you know, it's consistently positive, but I think we're around like in the mid-20s of response rates. And so it's not really
26%.
statistically reflective. And I'm assuming there's pockets that are more responsive than other pockets across the district. So in thinking through how do we do this, I agree with where Michelle, what you were saying about the school site councils are really a place where this work ought to be getting done, but we're not utilizing that, and it's connected to the LCAP. So as a starting point, like, how do we provide a baseline understanding of how that can work? And it's not going to be the same at every school site, but I think that that is a much better start to, like, if we can start measuring like engagement around school site councils. Do they have a full roster? Are they meeting regularly? Are they submitting updates on even a quarterly basis? Like, do we know what they're doing at the school site councils? A little more visibility in that process, I think, you know, do they have ELAC representation if that's something that is, that they ought to at their school site? You know, I think that that might start to provide more visibility of where in our system there's family engagement and where we're not getting that. And so, that gives us some idea of where we need to focus more and understand more. I mean, so that was just a long thought piece on really how, because this one's a hard one to measure outside of credentialing and hiring and that kind of stuff, but really the family engagement piece. And I think it would make our advisories more happy too, because I think right now they don't really have, they're active, but having a way to provide that input into the district so it's visible would be handy. So, yeah.
No, I think too, for me, I think for us as a district to figure out how do we balance some of, like, I think the indirect consequences of what the LCAP is. I feel like the LCAP was set up to create transparency and kind of understanding of decisions that the district was making. But I think what's happened is a lot of community members and even staff use it as a tool to try to get things added into the budget and to fix like structural issues in the district, which it isn't necessarily best suited to do. It is to list out how we're going to accomplish those, but not actually the place to engage in the conversation about addressing them and fixing them and holding the district fully accountable to addressing it. So I think figuring out how we want to hold that in these conversations and what new spaces we need to have to hold those conversations so we as a board can address them appropriately, whether it's through our visioning or other kind of things that we have the power to do, just so that the LCAP process doesn't have kind of the additional weight of fixing every problem in the district on a yearly basis as we go through.
Okay, let me see. Any final comments, colleagues, about any of this related to LCAP before we wrap up?
I really like the suggestion around the exploration around the of school site councils is like a built-in infrastructure. I served on SSC and working with primarily monolingual families. I think just to have that infrastructure could really just create community, right? Like, you just use that meeting time to then build community, to then talk about how we're interpreting from a very kind of technical plan to then really, how does that experience land at the school site? So I really love that opportunity to kind of explore that, because I think it is an underutilized infrastructure. So I just wanted to comment there.
Yeah, and I think in an ideal world, it could be like an iterative process where early in the year, school site councils are saying that these are our priorities, and that's kind of informing this process district-wide, and then vice versa, right? So they're framing it around, I just think there's a lot of potential there. And I also just wanted to say, echoing, I really like Anne Marie, or maybe it was Ritu, one of you, both, I think, said the the keep the lights on versus the priorities, I think is really, really important for us to distinguish. Because I think it's really easy to get into this thing where we're like, oh, I gotta stop. I'll finish my sentence. It's really easy to get into this thing where it's like, we have to put everything we do in the LCAP, right? And so that's fine, but like, if we don't list the priorities, then those are the keep the lights on things, which is fine. And like, these are the things that we think are high leverage. Okay, really grateful to my colleagues and to staff for, again, beginning this conversation. I think it was a great start and to be continued. So thanks so much to everyone and for all the materials too. This was really excellent. Really appreciate all the work from all the staff. Even the ones who didn't speak, thank you. We know you contributed. Thank you for being here. Okay, our final agenda item is a quick update on the PIF expenditure plan. So this is not designed to be a huge discussion item. Board, we can ask clarifying questions and whatnot, but we will have we can schedule a more in-depth discussion if we want. Mr. Diaz, good to see you. How long were you planning to take for the presentation portion?
I think this will be less than 10 minutes.
Great. I'm going to put you a timer for 5, and if you need to go over a little bit, that's good.
Oh, perfect. I can keep it to 5. So good evening, commissioners. As you know, my name is Evan Diaz, and I'm the director of the Public Education and Enrichment Fund. And this evening, I will share some information with you regarding PIF's timeline, some key dates, the projected revenue for fiscal year 21-22 and for 22-23, and lastly, the proposed PIF portfolio for fiscal year 22-23. In an effort to keep it to 5 minutes, because I think everyone here is familiar with this piece, so we can kind of skip ahead to the next one. Perfect. So I wanted to share with you an overview of the expenditure plan development process and where we currently stand at this point in the year. As you can see in the top swim lane, that's where our quarterly estimates are in the green, and we've received these quarterly from the SF Controller's Office. At this point, we've received 3 of those estimates, and we receive those 4 times a year. In the second row, you'll see the work that the PIF office and the district staff have already completed. Presently, program staff have already completed their spending proposals and have submitted them to the CAC for their review. The CAC has completed their review and is presently working on their recommendations for submission to the board and the superintendent. In the final row, you'll see, in the third row, you'll see sort of the work the CAC has been doing there in yellow, in the little yellow triangles, their monthly CAC meetings. And in blue are the Budget Business Services meeting where PIF has presented. And then finally, you'll see at the end there in the final row, the upcoming board presentations that both the PIF staff and the CAC will be providing to the board. Some key dates are today, we're here to present at the Budget Business Services Subcommittee, and then on June 14th, we'll be submitting the plan for first reading. And then the staff and the CAC will give a presentation at the Committee of the Whole on June 21st. And then if all goes well, on June 28th, we will meet for second reading, and hopefully the plan is approved. And then June 30th, we're sending it to the board, to the city of San Francisco for the annual submission. Next slide, please. Now I want to go over a little bit of our financial information. We'll start with fiscal year 22-23. As I mentioned, we receive these quarterly updates pretty regularly. So far, the annual projection for fiscal year 22-23 has been holding steady at around $88 million. And so that is the number we've used to build out the expenditure plan for next year. Next slide. This year has been a little bit, there's been a little bit of a fluctuation. As we know, we receive our funding from the city and the revenue that they collect, so a lot of the tax revenue that they collect. And so depending on where they forecast they are at that present time, we can see that the numbers can go up or down. So at this year, the start of this year, we started around $84 million, and then it took a dip to 81, and the latest projection is holding steady at 84. We're carefully watching the final projection for this year, and we will share that out as soon as we have it. Next slide. Overall, the 5-year projections from the city seem promising for PEEF. We're seeing steady increases over the next 5 years with a projection of about $105 million for fiscal year 25-26. Next slide. Here we're showing a sort of an outlook of our year for 22-23, sort of our revenues and expenses and the differences between them. In the first column, you'll see again the projected revenue, that $88 million, and how that splits evenly between SLAM and OGU. Our revenues, our expenses, our projected expenses for next year are around $90 million, and that's because our SLAM costs are slightly outpacing our projections. And so we will need to use a little bit of the SLAM fund balance in order to cover those costs if the projection stays the same from the city. And so you'll see there at the fund balance column, the second from the right, we have currently a SLAM fund balance of around $9 million or $9.8 million. As I mentioned, we'll need to use some of that to cover the cost for next year if all holds steady. We don't project, I'm almost done. We don't project a fund balance for OGU for next year, so that's a good sign. And yeah, we can go to the next slide. And lastly, this is what we are proposing the portfolio be for next year. There have been some adjustments that have happened throughout the year because of the overall district balancing plan. And those, you'll see those captured in programs like AVID and CTE. We've also looked at the dual funded programs that are currently funded on the portfolio, but also are funded by the Unrestricted General Fund, or UGF, and PEEF, and are proposing to shift some of those UGF costs onto PEEF to give relief to the Unrestricted General Fund. We're also proposing creating a OGU reserve to account for those fluctuations in revenue estimates from the city. So hopefully to minimize the impact on programming should the revenue decline throughout the year. And then lastly, we are proposing that programs that were previously funded on PEEF in the fiscal year 1920 and then were moved at the end of that year because PEEF revenue declined, were moved to the Unrestricted General Fund. We're proposing that some of those programs be moved back to the PEEF portfolio, and those are the ones that are sort of highlighted there with the stars. ELA supports, which used to be reading intervention for those who used to be on the CAC at that point, and STEM, math, and science. So there's just an overview. There's sort of highlights of what the portfolio will look like in fiscal year 22-23, and that concludes the short presentation.
Thank you very much. So my understanding of the purpose of this agenda item was really the update on the revenue projections, not a review of the portfolio. So I'm happy, but if people want to make comments on that, that's fine. But the committee's not sort of approving it or giving, right? So just to be clear, this was more of just an update on the revenue projections. But feel free, questions or comments on anything.
No surprise. I have been hearing from my PEEF-CAC members about, we don't have to go at length because I think it will come through in their recommendations, and I'm sure those conversations are quite lively right now. But I think there are some questions raised about the portfolio and well, I'll say Chief Wallace, Head of Finance Wallace, that the shifts from the unrestricted general funds to PEEF. So I think this is a theme we've seen in the last couple of years. So I think again, I don't want to go into discussion now, but just to know that I do think the recommendations coming from PFCAC will be along the lines of those themes.
And I also, well, so yes, if you would like to give us any sort of preview as to what we might be thematically hearing, that would be welcome. And hello, nice to see you. And the other thing I wanted to ask is, when we look at these projections going forward, what I've observed of PEEF is that they do swing. So while there's cause for excitement to, with the bar graphs, I caution us from getting too attached to those numbers that we see there, unless you have insight into why we should just be jubilant at this moment.
I don't personally have any more insight than what the city has shared with us. I also share your concern, and as we have shared in the PFCAC, Commission on Mobility, we've seen those swings happen over the last 2 years, and they've been extreme at some points. So yes, I would caution. I would use extreme caution when sort of getting too excited about the projections, because as we've seen even in this year, there've been dips in the revenue, and so we're hoping that it will stay steady at that 84, but we're not sure where we're going to end yet.
If I might add to that, though, just recognizing that this revenue source is tied to the trajectory of the city's unrestricted general fund, and that over these past couple of years, we've been tied up in a pandemic that have drawn down reduced revenues, local revenues, just from sales tax, hotel tax, all of these good things to help support PEEF. So I think looking at that multi-year projection from the city, because it is tied to the city's projections, just want to be clear about that. It is an indication of how the city is anticipating our local economy will be faring over the next several years. So that is positive, but as we go year over year, we have seen those dips both up and down. So I think it's good to know that, yes, I think we should anticipate growth, but it may not be quite as aggressive once we get into it as what we're currently seeing on that chart.
Commissioner, could I just add one point of information? And definitely heard the comment about not delving into the priorities, but just in case, whether now or later, this catches anyone's attention, the line item for AVID, just recall, if you will, that the funding for that program was substantially shifted over to the Educator Effectiveness Block Grant. So although you see a 0 on that slide for that row, it does not mean that that funding has been eliminated. It has mostly been transferred to that new state one-time grant.
Thank you. Yeah, it might be good to add that in the notes column, just so that in case it doesn't cause alarm.
If I might want to add one other comment about the priorities, I just want to be clear that for our budget balancing plan, departments were asked, and each division head was asked to make priorities, based upon our zero-based budgeting structure, and that the PEEF other general use funding was incorporated in that overall prioritization. So to the extent that there are cuts that were made within PEEF OGU, we had anticipated that those cuts would be backfilled with other priority programs. So I think it will be important to discuss that element, and trade-offs should there be recommendations to not move expenses from the unrestricted general fund onto PEEF, because the reality is that would create an imbalance on the unrestricted general fund.
Can I just ask one clarifying question? So around SLAM and the shifts, the cost shifts, is that because of the unrestricted general fund, things that used to be covered there moving on to PEEF even in SLAM, or is that truly that their costs are going up? If so, like, when you come back to present, it would be helpful to understand if that's an ongoing shift or, personnel, et cetera.
I would say for athletics, that is a shift. There were some costs that were on the peak baseline grant. And so we're proposing shifting those costs onto the annual allocation. The others are just natural growth of their programming and their staffing.
All right, any final comments from colleagues? Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Diaz. Thank you to everyone. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.